Hello, Art231. Hope everyone's doing okay and staying safe. Going to jump into the texture module today by showing a few slides and just chatting very quickly. So when we talk about texture in terms of art and design and set design and CG and painting and all of those things, we're talking about the visual or the tactile surface characteristics and appearance of something. Could be an animal, a person, a chunk of concrete, any living or inanimate object. And it's important to understand that we're talking about the visual or the tactile surface. So if we're talking about a movie set, typically in something that doesn't have CG in it, you're using actual stuff. You're using, like, there's a real couch in a living room with furniture and curtains and decoration and all that. In theater, we're often using a combination of real, so tactile textures in costumes, but also visual textures where you might have drops that are just painted to look like something, or some props, a styrofoam piece of something that's painted to look like metal, or something like that. And certainly in painting and in CG, you're talking about complete illusion, just visual texture where you're trying to replicate the look of a texture, not actual texture on a surface. Something to keep in mind is that the way that we see and interpret and understand texture visually is through how much light reflects. So we understand texture in a tactile sense by touching it, and we identify something as rough or smooth. All of those things are tactile. But when we're looking at something, it's really through how that light is reflected or diffused. So in the middle, when we talk about specular reflection, that's something like a piece of metal that, as you polish it, it becomes smoother and smoother and then shinier and shinier because it reflects light in an even and very predictable way. Where we look at the image on the far right, diffuse reflection, that's like rock or again a chunk of granite or something like that with a very irregular surface, and so the light doesn't bounce off it in an even way, and that's what tells our eye the difference between something that's smooth and something that's rough. So just a quick example of how light can impact our reading of a surface. So these next three photos are all of the exact same material, just the wall in my office. And so this is under very, very flat light early in the morning, lots of cloud cover. So we see some value variation, but it reads, we assume that is bumpy because there's lots of variation, but don't really have much sense of the actual texture. So when the light starts to rake across it at a little stronger angle, now we have more sense of kind of the height difference because we see the difference in the lightest value and the darkest value. And then when you have really extreme bright light, then we've kind of erased all those mid-tones and we're seeing that same wall. There's no photo effects on these or anything. It's just the effect of the light. Because it's at such a harsh angle and quite intense, we're really just seeing the highest points and the lowest points and nothing in between. Something else to keep in mind about texture, whether you're painting illusionary texture or you're assembling actual things for a film set, that has real texture is, think about the surface of the material versus the surface coating of the material. So that fire hydrant on the left, there's things in the actual cast iron that give it some texture. The weld mark up the middle here, right? That's actual texture in the metal. This little seam here, that's texture in the metal. The kind of pitted surface is in the metal. Whereas if we look at the image on the right, the peeled paint and all of the wear, that's from the surface coating. So that's not in the actual cast chunk of metal. That's in the surface coating. When we talk about virtual texture, that is completely illusionary. That's just made up of pixels, and we really just want to control the dark and the light. So this is just a ZBrush sculpture. This is all virtual. There's no paint or any surface involved at all. And there's lots of software programs for CG that reproduce texture. And the last point I want to make about surface, like painted surface and actual texture, is the painted surface and the related texture can really push your narrative in a certain direction. So the droid on the far left, the black, looks fairly new. It just, or maybe it's never gone outside. Obviously the color choice black, we assume it's maybe not one of the good guys, but it's really about the surface and the lack of wear that we start to understand the story, where that droid in the middle, obviously there's a color choice, but there's also the surface wear and the deterioration where you see some of the paint has been worn off, and it's been through much more than that black droid on the left. So that one in the middle, that droid has seen some shit. Finally, when we talk about illusionary texture, well, not finally, sorry, I tricked you. The reason that romantic painters were so good at painting texture is they really understood color and value, and how color and value work together. So again, this is paint. This is all paint. There's no actual texture here. It's not a photograph of real things. It's an artist that understands light and color, and that's how you create texture. Okay, for sure the last point I want to make is about when you're trying to draw texture or paint textured surfaces. And so we'll just use this example of a wall. And the little drawing demo that I put a link in Blackboard to, the guy that's drawing those kind of time-lapse textures, he uses this method without color though. So the first thing we want to decide on is the shapes. What are the shapes of our surface? Is there a pattern? Is it regular? Is it irregular? And then we want to think about the value. So here we have a mid-tone and then a slightly lighter tone, and those are the base values. And once we have that value structure, then we can think about the hue, and that hue is that kind of reddish orange. It's kind of that mid value and the kind of mid to low intensity. Then we can start adding bits of light. So the only difference between those last two images is we have this regular pattern of lighter value across the surface in a somewhat regular way, but with some variety. And then we move to add the dark. So we started with our mid-tone, we added light, we added dark in a somewhat predictable, yet somewhat irregular pattern. And now we start to see the illusion of light across the surface. We can add some further variety, some further realism, to this by giving it a bit of history. So there's some different age bricks. Maybe a couple of them have been replaced. Add some wear and tear, and then some pure surface that has nothing to do with the wall itself. It's just paint or dirt that's applied on top. So those are the things to keep in mind if you're trying to replicate surface, either digitally or traditionally with paint or with drawing. Is you want to get the shapes, then you want to get the value, then you want to think about the hue, right? What is the main color palette? And then you want to push the lights, push the darks, add some variation and believability, and add some history to it. And maybe the history is a complete lack of history. Maybe it needs to look brand new, or maybe it's have some wear and tear on it. And are there things stuck to it? Are there stickers on it? Is there paint on it? Are there posters taped to it? Again, to try to push that believability and to be able to make this wall part of your scene. It's not just a wall, it's not just a stand-in, but it actually has some history to it.